and Chinese. And this last summer I studied abroad in Beijing and studied language and also did research on environment and NGOs in Beijing, in China. And today we are going to be presenting about U.S.-Chinese relations as well as an organization called Project Pengyou, which Andy and I had the honor to go to a conference with Project Pengyou over spring break at Harvard University talking about grassroots change and youth engagement promoting cooperative Chinese-U.S. relations. And so what we're going to do today, we're going to start out with talking about perceptions. What are these perceptions about Chinese-U.S. relations? Then we're going to talk about reality. What's the reality? What are the facts on the ground? Then we're going to move on. We're going to talk about ideology. So how does ideology and different mindsets in America and China complicate this reality? Then we move on to cooperation. So why is it important that we cooperate? Why is this relationship important? And what is at stake here? And finally, we're going to talk about grassroots and what you and us at St. Olaf can do to help. So, before we bore you with our introduction, we will start. So, perspectives. So we're going to, for this point, we're going to be more interactive because this is a huge group, all right? That's what you do. Okay, so what are your perceptions on China? So when you think of China, maybe Chinese students, you might have, you can speak up to this. But when you think of China, what do you guys think of? What does the media tell you? You guys can just shout it out. So when I think of it, before I started studying Chinese, I thought of fortune cookies, which we all know is not Chinese. But okay, anyone else? Population. There's tons of people there, right? Tons. Anything else? Scott?
Economic growth.
Economic growth. Nice. Just say it. Communism. Right. Yeah, that's right. Communism. Okay. Anything else?
Our personal bank.
What?
Our personal bank.
Yeah, nice.
There you go.
Anything else? Jin Xiao, you got some. Come on. Okay, I like to throw people under the bus, so be careful. Okay, so, just looking at what's in our media, some political cartoons. You see Obama and Xi Jinping. You see Obama saying, what does he get to eat to grow that big? And you see the Chinese economy, which is represented as a dragon that's about to probably pounce on Obama, right? Mr. Obama. So, kind of scary. And this one you see an old Uncle Sam, a little bit out of his prime, kind of filling with some silverware, trying to control the world. But then you see a bigger Chinese hand using chopsticks and actually controlling Uncle Sam. And so this represents the fear that, America, we think we're the best, we've been on top for a long time, and maybe we still think we're on top, but also we're afraid that behind it all is the Chinese economy, the Chinese growing military, starting to control the world instead. In this last cartoon, you see an old Uncle Sam, getting old, getting gray hair, right? He's asking this fortune teller, who could probably be wearing more clothes, can you tell me more about my future? And, she says the funny thing, I would, but I can't read Chinese. So it's this fear-mongering that China will someday own America or be controlled, will control our future. And so now we're going to talk about reality, so xianshu. We're going to do a brief introduction about for U.S.-Chinese history and relations starting in around the 1900s. And kind of in the backdrop is in the 1940s, in the Chinese Civil War, you have Mao Zedong with the Communist Party and Chiang Kai-shek with the Nationalist Party that was funded by the U.S. government. And at that time, actually, Chiang Kai-shek lost, and he and his forces retreated to Taiwan. And that's when you start having a relationship where the U.S. is funding Taiwan, and China starts aligning itself with the Soviet Union, and you start to see a real relationship of strategic distrust. And so what we're going to be talking about in this history, especially in the 2000s and late 1990s, is you see mutual distrust, both the U.S. distrusting China and the Chinese distrusting the U.S. So during the Cold War in 1971, this is a picture actually of the U.S. ping pong team in China. And that is actually a big event because at this point, China and the U.S. were rivals up until now, but China is actually splitting with the Soviet Union in the 1970s. And you see here U.S. rapprochement and setting ping pong, what is called ping pong diplomacy. Bob, are you in this picture? I didn't see you, but you were. Okay. Oh, you took the picture. Okay, that's good. Bob took the picture. This is in 1972, and this is when actually President Nixon comes and visits China. And this is also a really big deal. I think it's actually the first U.S. president to visit China, and it's just a significance of reestablishing relations with China. And so you have Mao Zedong and Nixon shaking hands. And the 1990s. The 1990s is actually a really busy and full year for U.S.-Chinese relations. It starts off with the Tiananmen incident and U.S. imposing economic sanctions on China. And China is frustrated because, again, it feels the U.S. is impeding in its internal affairs. You also see around this time the Soviet Union collapses around 1991, and the Berlin Wall falls. And actually this, again, stirs Chinese fear that the West is encroaching upon communism and that ideology. Also then, in around 1994, President Bill Clinton of the United States links China's most favored trade nation status. So basically, giving them special trade deals with the U.S. So he links that status with China's improvement on human rights. And so again, from the Chinese perspective, this is the U.S. interfering in Chinese affairs. And then 1994, 1995, you see this is the map of Taiwan and China. You have the Taiwan Strait crisis, which was kind of abrogated after a long history of the U.S. selling arms to China. The U.S. grants a visa to the Taiwanese president Lee Teng-hui, who then goes and visits his college in the United States. And in response, China is afraid that the United States is supporting a Taiwanese movement towards independence, and so they start firing missiles towards the strait and having some military exercises. And in turn, the U.S. sends in some battleship carrier groups, and there's a lot of tension in the strait. And then we go on to the 2000s, which actually is kind of spurred in 1999. The U.S. and NATO are intervening in Yugoslavia, and they accidentally bomb a Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which is not a good idea if you're the U.S. at that point. And so you see a protest with the Chinese, a U.S. bomb. They're very nationalist at this point, very frustrated. Again, they see that this was not an accident. Rather, the U.S. was targeting China, weakening China. Of course, the U.S. says it is an accident. But then later in the 2000s, we also, I think in 2001 or 2003, one of those years, there was an incident where you had a U.S. plane flying over and doing some mapping of the Chinese region, the Pacific region, and actually collides with a Chinese fighter jet. And it's called the EP-3 incident. And again, it heightens Chinese suspicions that the U.S. is spying and impeding on China's internal affairs. But after that, it kind of evens out in the George Bush era. China goes back and forth between critiquing U.S. engagement in Iraq. And then that leads us to the Obama administration in the late 2000s. And so in 2011, we see a term arise called Obama's Pacific Pivot. And this is in response to, in somewhat response to a theory of China's peaceful rise, which officially came about, I think, in the early 2000s. And so China's peaceful rise, or 中国和平崛起, basically says, from the Chinese point of view, when we develop, we don't have to develop like the West. The West, World War I, World War II, many wars in Europe to become strong, powerful nations. China does not have to develop this way. They can develop harmoniously. They will not be a destabilizing power in the region. Instead, they will work with other countries and really focus on building their internal economy and living standard up, rather than destabilizing the rest of the world. Now, there is evidence then to suggest that the U.S. government does not really believe this philosophy. And so Obama's Pacific Pivot in 2011, or Obama the 中国亚太, is really a significant shift of U.S. resources over to the Pacific Asia region at this time. That's military, that's economy, that's diplomacy. And so you see the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership with the U.S. reaching out to other countries in the Pacific with trade agreements. And you see naval capabilities and military moving out into the Pacific region. And so this is a chart here, which has the percent of U.S. naval capacity on the bottom. And in the green here is the dark green is Pacific, so percentage of U.S. types of Navy ships, so frigates, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, that is in the Pacific. Light green is Atlantic, and the gray right on the bottom is Persian Gulf. And it's hard to see, so there's between 40 and 60%. You see the dark green, this is 2013, coming a little bit past that midline. So all of them are a little bit now almost past that 50% mark. And that's because with the Obama's Pacific Pivot, the goal is now to have 60% of our naval capabilities within the Pacific region. And so as we disengage from areas like Afghanistan and Iraq, we're looking to re-engage and put more resources into the Asia Pacific. And this is a really interesting map that really shows why China might not be comfortable with this and might suspect the U.S. With this specific pivot. In the red, you see all the places that U.S. has troops stationed around Asia. So in South Korea, 25,000 U.S. troops. Japan, 35,000. Guam, 2,000, and also bases in Singapore and Australia. And so, as you can imagine from a Chinese perspective, what this looks like is a ring. And it goes back to a Cold War term and fear called containment. And so you see China's point of view, they see this as a policy of containment. They're worried that the U.S. rebalancing pivot to Asia is actually a method of halting and infringing upon Chinese power and growth. And so you see, through this, a lot of distrust being built by both nations. And then lastly, some recent news articles and things that we all might have heard of recently in the news. This is actually on while warning of Chinese cyber threats. US launches its own attack in the news in NPR April 2nd, so just out. A lot of cyber threats going on where the NSA will start hacking Huawei or some Chinese companies to get information from them, and then will blame China's military for sending viruses over to America, and it kind of goes back and forth nagging. And then on this side, this graphic, it's basically trade imbalance. And so while the U.S. exports to China are large, but China's exports to the U.S. are much, much larger. And so you hear complaints about U.S. jobs going to China, our currency being held by the Chinese, and this being a problem, and us fearing that the Chinese holding our currency and having this trade imbalance are getting more and more powerful while we are getting weaker and weaker.
So next we'll talk about ideology. So Kyle talked about our differences in political systems and economies, but what about how we think? Our 思想, right? I hope that's right, guys. All right. So this is going to be a little bit interactive. Okay, so I will read. How this is set up is we have a perspective or an ideology on the U.S. side on the left and the Chinese side on the right. So I will say something like Greek tradition of justice and truth for the U.S. because that's what we believe in America. Justice and truth, right, will prevail. And on the right, you guys are going to have to help me figure out what that Chinese counterpart is. So can you guys think of what is the counterpart to our traditions, our traditional beliefs?
Confucian hierarchy.
Confucianism, yeah. Anything else? Okay, you got it. Yeah, Confucianism, loyalty and duty, right? So these are very different, and if you want to understand our differences in our ideologies, you have to understand these. All right, we have a lot more than one. So okay, this is fun. So the U.S., right? We like our youth. They're hip. They're cool. They're awesome, right? We're youth. We have a big youth culture, right? What about China? What? Elders. What, they don't care about their youth? Is that what you're saying? No. Okay, elders. Any other ideas? Right, they respect for age, so they would never send their parents to a nursing home. That would be rude. Well, maybe they are. Maybe that's changing that. I'm not sure. But that would be. All right, U.S. same language. So in English, what do you call a person who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you call a person who speaks 2 languages? What do you call a person who speaks 1 language? American, right? We're all dumb. We don't know how to speak any language, right? So we all speak the same language. What about in China? Dialects. Yeah, any other ideas? You guys are really chatty. Right. So different languages, all under the umbrella of Chinese, but there's tons of dialects everywhere. You can go across the street and probably encounter a different dialect. Bob says he has his own Northfield dialect.
Wait,
So.
I know it's my own personal dialect.
Your own
It's own tones.
Okay, right. So we're creating new dialects all the time. I have my own dialect too. So yeah. All right. So the U.S. we like conflict. We like dispute, right? We like fighting. Our government fights. We shut it down. Nobody cares, right? We're always fighting. All right. What about China? What? Harmony? You guys are too good. I don't even have to do this. All right, harmony. Yeah, right. They don't want to fight. They have one party over there, right? They don't want to. They just want to be peaceful, harmonious. Yeah, we like fighting. Okay. Individual rights, right? We're all about our individual rights. You have the right to not listen to me right now, right? It's your right, but you should, because I want you to. But we all have individual rights. So what about China? Do they value individual rights?
Community well-being.
Yep. Community. Social stability. Any other ideas? Right, group needs, right? There's a lot of people over there. And I think China's concerned with raising the status of all of their Chinese citizens, not just for individual ones. Being individual would maybe be considered selfish. All right, let's be honest, guys. U.S. has the superior culture, right? We're exporting our Hollywood movies, our Lady Gagas, you know what I'm saying? We have the superior culture. All right, what about China? What do they think about their culture?
I think that they're
Traditional,
It's pretty ancient.
ancient. But, you know, they like their culture too, right? They like it too. So, you know, I think through this you see that there's not only differences in our political ways of thinking, but also in just our ideologies. And this is important if we want to learn how to cooperate with each other. Oh, wow. That was...
Yeah. So cooperation. I talked a little about political, economic problems, and you talked about how ideology differences might complicate U.S.-China relations. But exactly why is it important? I mean, why can't we just distrust each other? Why can't we just argue about whose culture is superior? Why do we actually need to cooperate? What we're going to go through now are actually some situations in the world actually where U.S. and China actually benefit a lot to cooperate, and the world would benefit from it too, actually.
So as you see in this plot, this is a plot of percent of global energy demand. On the x-axis you have years, so starting from 1970 going all the way to 2030, that's a projection obviously. And on the y-axis you do have the percent of global energy demand with the US in blue and the communist China in red, right? So you see in the 70s, the United States demand for global energy was huge. They were taking around 40% of the global energy. That's ginormous. And China was just taking like 5%. And now in 2010, you see that's about even. There's maybe about 20% each nation. And then it's projected that China will surpass the United States energy demand and demand much more energy for all their people. So this is something that the United States and China should cooperate in.
Of course, going along with energy demand, you have CO2 emissions. And so when you're burning fossil fuels, you're going to emit CO2. When you have more cars in China, you have China emitting more CO2. And so here you see a clear trend. Again, United States blue, China red. 1960s, United States contributing to over 40% of the global CO2 emissions. China, around 10%. But as we come closer to the present, in 2010, you see that China has actually passed US as far as percent of global CO2 emissions. And so in an era where global climate change is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, we're having dialogues about cleaner fuels, about putting caps on CO2 emissions. Our two nations have to cooperate on this issue because one of them isn't going to do without the other. We're both going to have to agree to say, okay, we're going to do something about CO2, we're going to do something about climate change together.
And then our last plot here, we have the percent of global trade. So as you can see, blue, the United States takes up a big chunk from the 70s all the way to the projected 2030s. But see, China has also been increasing. China's been increasing a ton, and in 2010, they're slightly under the blue, but it is projected in 2020 and 2030 that their percentage of global trade will surpass the United States. So this is in everybody's best interest to cooperate with the United States and China.
So again, using some current news clips from so this is from the Diplomat 2013, talking about the WTO, so the World Trade Organization. China got in, I think, around 2001. The U.S. and China now have been, ever since, trying to cooperate in the WTO, but also bickering a lot about trade disputes, about currency disputes, and it doesn't help the U.S. and China trade, it doesn't help the global economy, and it's really in both our nations' best interest, as well as the world, to cooperate in institutions like the WTO and with trade policy.
Kyle talked a little bit about CO2 emissions, but there's also that big problem of pollution. So if any of you guys have been to China, in major cities, you'll know what pollution is. Probably breathed it in. But yeah, there's a recent study out that all of the pollution that was produced in China, some of it has gone all the way over the Pacific, and they have read some of that in California. So there's been traces of Chinese pollution within California. So this is becoming a global problem of all this pollution sharing, I guess I can say. So this is something that we will want to cooperate.
Another issue is hacking. Again, we already talked about that. Cyber threats, but also military cooperation. So as the U.S. rebalances to Asia, we have more ships going into the Pacific. Our communication with China is critical. Our sharing of our intentions of why we're there, and then talking to them about what you guys feel about that and what you're going to do is very critical. So cooperating on whether it's technology sharing or cooperating on why we don't want to share technology is crucial for both our nations really to get along in that region as the U.S. increasingly focuses its troops and military forces in the Asia Pacific.
So there's always land disputes, right? But within the China Sea and in the Pacific, there's a lot of islands that are being disputed currently. There's one big one called the Diaoyudao, or the Senkaku Islands. And that's a dispute between China and Japan. And if there ever were to be a war that breaks out, which would be unfortunate, the U.S. is bound by international treaties to defend Japan. So we would be involved in a war if something bad were to break out. So this is another reason why we want to cooperate.
And of course, there's also North Korea. Many of you remember maybe in 2013 last year, maybe in February, March, a lot of talk about North Korea with missiles and nuclear threats. And China actually is North Korea's only remaining ally at this point. And they have the greatest power to levy with North Korea and talk to them and pacify them when tensions arise. And so it's in the U.S.'s best interest, and in fact we're already doing this, but to cooperate with China and have good relations with China so that we can respond to threats and destabilization from North Korea when those situations arise.
Lastly, we should cooperate in terms of our educational exchange. So currently now in the United States, there's over 200,000 Chinese international students studying at our universities. Yay, Chinese international students! Okay, and right now there's a little over 20,000 American students studying abroad in China. So there's a big gap, but with all these students, the student exchange between the two countries, we want to cooperate in our educational exchanges.
And that brings us right up to grassroots change. And this is, again, Project Pengyo, talking about what that organization is and why we are here today. And so the conference really equipped us. It was actually a leadership and grassroots training conference. And it equipped us to be here today and talk about what is the mission of Project Pengyo and what we're going to do at campus. Project Pengyo, the headquarters are in Beijing. It's a non-governmental organization, and so it also works in the U.S. and is funded by some foundations in the U.S., and it's looking to really empower youth engagement with China and the U.S. So it's working with Obama's 100,000 Strong for China initiative, which has the goal of having 100,000 U.S. students studying abroad in China. It's also working to create an alumni network of people who have gone to China and come back and have resources and a network to connect with, to talk about their experiences, and then to share those with other youth in the United States. And so these are the Project Pengyo core beliefs. And we actually just took these right off their website, and I'll read them to you and talk about them a little bit, but you can read right along. So the first one is, we believe the United States and China hold the world's most important bilateral relationship, but the relationship is highly complex, challenging, and multifaceted. So whether it's differences in ideology, whether it's strategic distrust, military, economic problems, there are a lot of challenges, but again, we are the world's biggest CO2 producers. We're the world's strongest economies. It is critical that we do cooperate. We believe U.S.-Chinese relations carry tremendous economic value and global importance. So again, we're some of the biggest, most powerful nations in the world. It's critical for a peaceful world that we cooperate on a variety of issues. We believe Americans with frontline experiences in China are our most crucial and valuable asset in managing U.S.-China ties. And so that's us and you. And regardless of whether you've been to China or not, just as long as you're interested in China, you're learning about China currently, you can help. And it's with the belief that our youth, this right here, this generation, is the next generation of leaders. And the U.S. and China both are going to depend on us to have open mindsets when we encounter differences in ideology and to really work to improve the situation. And the last one is, we believe all American and China alumni can and should play a major role in pioneering a robust and mutually beneficial relationship between our two nations. Which brings us again back to grassroots, with us here at St. Olaf being a motus of change, which we're now going to talk about some more.
Yeah, so these are pretty big overarching themes, goals. I mean, how can we bring this to a small liberal arts campus like St. Olaf? Kyle and I have talked a lot about this, and we will show you what that looks like in the next slide. But I'd first like to read you our mission statement for our St. Olaf Project Pengyo chapter. We are organizing students and faculty of St. Olaf to build a network of engaged Pengyos by creating bridges between colleges, St. Olaf and Carleton, American and Chinese students, Chinese researchers and students, and current St. Olaf organizations in order to expand and improve U.S.-China relations. Again, this is Question?
Just for the sake of some students here who may not know Chinese, what does Pengyo mean in the
Great question. We should pay you now because we didn't say that. Pengyo means friend or friendship in Chinese. So Project Pengyo, Project Friendship. Good question. That should have been the first thing we said. So I'll start. So how we will do this is we plan on building bridges. One gap we saw at St. Olaf was St. Olaf and Carleton collaboration. So Carleton is a great college. They have a lot of resources. They have a great Chinese program over there. And we haven't really tapped into that. I am a senior here at St. Olaf, and I do not know a single Carleton student who's studying Chinese, which is kind of sad. You know, I spent 4 years here, and it'd be fun if we could have more collaborative events. I'm sure they have great resources that we could tap into. And they could tap into St. Olaf resources. Do we have a time, right?
And there's also building bridges between actual American and Chinese students at St. Olaf. So I've been here for 4 years, and I have quite a few Chinese friends, but I would love to know some more. But honestly, it's hard. And I remember when I was actually in China, it was easiest for me to make friends with American students because I was out of place, I was uncomfortable, and they speak my language, and so there's a barrier between me and the Chinese even when I was in China. And it was hard for me to get to know them and even approach them. And so we would actually like to look at how we can at St. Olaf created a closer-knit community of both Chinese and Americans because we believe that we have a lot to learn from each other, a lot to share with each other, and there are some great potential friendships that can be made here.
Another bridge we'd like to build is between the Chinese researchers here and students. So we have one Fulbright scholar from China in the audience, Chongda. I won't, yeah, right there in the center, look at her. She doesn't like attention, so I just want to throw it all at her. But she's great, she's fun. She's right now she's a TA, I think. She lives in the Chinese house. We also have 2 ECNU scholars from Shanghai here, and these are 3 great resources for people who are thinking of studying abroad to China. If they have questions about Chinese universities or anything, or just want to talk about China or learn Chinese, whatever. These are great resources here that I think a lot of students don't really know, especially the ECNU scholars, since they aren't involved in classes. So this would be another great thing to try to build.
Also thinking about bridging, how can we bridge across different student organizations? And what this really is based upon is the fact that, you know, Chinese-U.S. relations, sure, there's economic aspects, there's political aspects, but there's also art, and there's culture, there's philosophy, and there's religion. And there's a whole ton of campus groups focusing on these things. And we'd love to reach out to them, have dialogues with them, maybe host events with them, to really show the spectrum of what cooperating and what understanding China and the U.S. actually looks like.
Another thing we'd like to do is work on academic and professional opportunities and provide more of those. One way we'd like to do this is working on the HSK, providing more awareness of that. Does anyone know what the HSK is? Oh, you guys are all smart. Okay, yeah, professors. Oh, yeah, thanks for raising your hand. Yeah, so the HSK is like the Chinese, a Chinese language test. So just like Chinese students have to take the TOEFL for their English. Yeah, and we will talk. Or no, I'll say it now. A lot of people, when I studied abroad, everyone was studying Chinese for their HSK. You know, they're doing it for their testing. They wanted to test into a higher HSK level so they'd have more opportunities. And most of the Americans didn't even know what HSK was. I didn't know what it was until I went to Shanghai. So I was like, what the heck is HSK? So one nice thing about the HSK, Kyle and I took the HSK last year, and now he is applying for the Confucius Institute Scholar, the Confucius Scholarship, and will hopefully get it, right? We're all praying for it, right? Or whatever. And yeah, and through this, in order to apply for the scholarship, he had to have taken the HSK. So if you take the HSK, you have more opportunities to go to China. So another bridge would be more awareness of the HSK.
But then how do we actually get there? What are the strategies we're going to take, the steps we're going to take to accomplish these goals at mission statement? Well, obviously the first step starts with all of you guys right here. Really appreciate you guys being here today on a Friday afternoon. And it starts with recruiting members and also developing a leadership team. So beyond actually having members to attend events and coordinate events, me and Andy, unfortunately, we're seniors. We know you guys love us, but we're actually going to be leaving here in a month, sadly, and we're really looking to pass it on. And we're really looking to take the skills we learned at our conference and equip a leadership team of students here at St. Olaf to program great events next year and continue the program on into the future.
One way we'd like to incorporate more Chinese student involvement would be on our leadership team that Kyle just talked about. we could invite a Chinese student to be at least one Chinese student. So then those Chinese students can tap into their Chinese friends, and the other maybe American students can tap into their friends to make events more diverse, I guess.
Another thing, especially with Carleton and St. Olaf building bridges, this year we would like to have one event with Carleton and just kind of a casual meet and greet with Carleton, maybe at the Chinese house, just so where we can get to know Carl's, they can get to know us, and hopefully that'll set up the foundation for a good relationship next year where we can work together with them to pool resources and have some cool events together.
Another thing we mentioned was collaborating with student organizations. So there's a lot of great student organizations here on campus already. The Political Awareness Committee has a very strong organization, a lot of money too, so we could use that money to bring in Chinese speakers, right? The CCC Chinese Culture Club, that's a great group that has a lot of Chinese members, so if we tapped into the Chinese CCC, we could get more Chinese student involvement. Honor Society, so there's a Political Science Honor Society. Kyle's a part of that. He's doing great things. You know, he can tell you more about this after the talk. And the Chinese House. I live in the Chinese House now, and it's a great venue to host anything. Kind of out of the way, but once you get there, right now it's kind of nice out, so it's not so bad. But when it's cold, whatever. Anyways, I go off on tangents. But the Chinese House is a good venue that you could use if we ever wanted to host events.
And lastly, pretty simple, HSK study groups. And so as Andy mentioned before, taking the HSK can open up a lot of opportunities, whether it's academic, whether it's being able to put on your resume, I have proven this level of 4 or 5 or 6 Chinese proficiency. But honestly, no one really wants to take another test and study for it and take it alone. And so we'd really like to, next year, maybe encourage the leaders next year and put in a framework where there's HSK study groups, so where students are encouraged to get together, study, prepare for the HSK, carpool down to the U of M, really close. That they have a Confucius Institute where we took it, and take it together, study together, and hopefully build a kind of a culture of taking that test and preparing for professional life beyond graduation.
So timeline, so what's next? So if you guys are interested in learning more about or if you guys are interested in becoming a member or being part of the leadership team, we have a meeting scheduled for next Thursday in Thompson 300 from 11:15 to 12 p.m. So there we can discuss more of how we will move forward and what we're looking for within the leadership team.
And then our goal is by April 21st to actually have the leadership team identified and start working with them to develop them and empower them and connect them with resources within the national network of Project Pengyo.
Also, by the end of the year, we'd like to host an event with Carleton at the Chinese House. Now, keep in mind the year is almost done. I think we have like a month, a little over a month. So people get busy, and I know it's scaring some people. I'm sorry. So we would really like to, with this leadership team we have identified by April 21st, we would like to have them host an event at the Chinese House with Carleton students, so that next year when Project Pengyo comes back after a fun summer, they can get on the ground running and already have resources at Carleton and know people there on a first-name basis.
And then we want to prepare for National Pengyo Day in November. And this is actually part of the national network, the National Project Pengyo organization, and they are working with the U.S. State Department to get a National Pengyo Day on the State Education Week calendar. And this will kind of like an Earth Day type of situation where they are looking for at least 100 organizations around the U.S. to put on events about U.S.-Chinese relations, promoting people to speak Chinese, learn Chinese, what have you. And so we really want to think about what unique event can we do on that day to be part of a greater national movement. And so that actually leads us to about all we have here. We are really thankful that you guys came here today. We know it's really sunny and beautiful and nice out, and this is actually a logo that we just got from Project Pengyo, because we, out of 40 different leadership fellows, we're actually the first chapter to actually start, or the first group of students to actually start a chapter and hold an event. And so you see here on this link is projectpengyo.org/SOLA. You can go there, and it's kind of like a LinkedIn and Facebook for China alumni, and you can check that out. Andy have fortune cookies, and we also have sign-up sheets here that we'll pass along, and we encourage you, if you're interested in joining, to put your name down and sign up. And again, we have questions here in a second, but we thank you all so much for coming. Yeah, Mara.
Is that the official link with the start spelling of SOLA?
That's an interesting point. I believe it's not. I believe, yeah, okay, yeah, that's a good point. Well, talk to them about that, Mars.
I'm sorry.
Very observant of you.
We're aware of it.
No, that's good. I'm glad you pointed that out. I was not aware of it. Thank you for that. So yeah, well, let me pass out, hordes of
Fortune cookies, these represent Chinese food. You know, when I was in China, I ate fortune cookies every day. So there you go.
Well, if you guys have no more questions, we hope to see you guys April 17th, 11:15 to 12. Oh, wait, there's a question.
So, you were presenting about like how there's a lot of different ideologies.
Yeah.
And you were talking about how you might be able to like different things. Like, what do you have any sort of ideas of how that might motivate them in the art and some other things? Like, would you as an organization would be like here on campus or like Carlton or like how would
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I think it kind of looks like everything you kind of mentioned. So, one thing, event, stretching out, building relationships between U.S. and Chinese students on campus will be a big way to understand each other. Because at the end of the day, we're not trying to make someone, be exactly like someone else, but we want to make people understand each other. We want to make people be able to see where their backgrounds are, where they're coming from. So, whether it's just building friendships or it is hosting events with an art department or art group talking about this is what Chinese art looks like, this is how it's different from the U.S., this is how they're similar, or this is talking about religions. And then, so stretch out to Carleton, engaging with their resources. They have a Chinese Culture Club, that's large. They have like a Chinese Business Connections Club, which is large. So, cooperating with them, sharing our resources between them. But really a focus on relationships and individual, day-to-day connections that we would build. I think St. Olaf already does a really good job with this. So we have Asia Weeks this week that does a really good job with that. We have a lot of different events that have to do with Asia, not only China, but Asia. So I think St. Olaf is already doing a pretty good job with this, and I think Project Conyo can even enhance that. So, yeah. Any other questions? Madam Lee.
Is the Project Conyo network just American? Because you said it's a Beijing organization, or is
Yeah, the headquarters are in Beijing.
do they have is there like a